In this lecture, we will focus on what's listed here as poem number 3. That is the second in the first cycle. It pertains to theme B, that is body behavior, and this particular instance will deal with body behavior in a positive way that contrasts the next time we come to body behavior. That will be in poems 6 and 7. In that case, body behavior will take on a negative hue. Back to poem 3, we're entitling this, "For Life and Health, Train Your Body in Forthright Behaviors." This is an 8-verse poem spanning Proverbs chapter 4, beginning verse 20, extending to verse 27. In this lecture, the grandfather sage leaves no doubt but that to travel the wisdom way will require disciplines of body and mind, and so will yield benefits of resounding well-being that are not strictly ethereal, but actually bring health, as it says in chapter 4, verse 22b, health for one's entire flesh. Let's consider the position of this poem within the context of the book of Proverbs. By this point in the lessons that span Proverbs 4 through 9, the father sage has introduced his own father as an honored source of legacy wisdom. Above all else, acquire wisdom, came the grandfather's first exhortation within chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Following that introduction, the grandfather initiated a 3-lecture cycle with a reprimand that urged his son to exit the wrong road. Cling to the route of discipline by exiting the route of the guilty. That was the title that we assigned to the poem beginning in chapter 4, verse 10, continuing through verse 19. Poem number 3 that we're studying now will continue the journey motif by showing how particular body parts have a role to play if one is serious about traveling in the way of wisdom, the way that the sage commended there in poem number 2. And next, consider the ensuing context following this poem number 3. After fortifying the demands of the wisdom way here in poem 3, with 8 verses that specify behaviors of body and mind, the grandfather will then unveil in poem 4 the hazard, the temptation lurking in the shadows, resisting which calls for those disciplines of body and mind that are presented here in poem 3. There, in a lengthy lecture of 23 verses, the sage will sound an urgent caution, warning how devastatingly seductive is this enemy that's called the foreign woman, especially in the eyes of a susceptible young man. Nor is she strictly metaphoric, for faithful honor and enjoyment of the youth's own wife poses as the supreme antidote to the wiles of this so-called foreign woman. That all takes place in poem number 4, which we're entitling, "Avoid the enslaving foreign woman, delight in your wife and find fruitfulness." That spans all of chapter 5. Next, let's read through this brief poem or lecture, beginning with chapter 4, verse 20. "My son, pay attention to my words. To what I say, turn your ear. May they not disappear from your eyes. Keep them safe within your mind. For they are life itself to those who find them, and for one's entire flesh, healing. Against every imprisonment, protect your mind, for from there life springs forth. Rid yourself of a twisted mouth, and put crooked lips far from you. May your eyes focus directly ahead, and may even your glances aim straight opposite you. Pave the track for your feet, and all your ways will be made solid. Don't turn either right or left. Rid your feet of wrong. For the next few minutes, I'd like to direct your attention to a translational issue surrounding verse 23. Verse 23 reads, "Against every imprisonment, protect your mind, for from there life springs forth." Perhaps as you listen to me read that, you hear the emphasis on the word life. The more time that I spend in the book of Proverbs, the more I am persuaded that whenever we encounter the word life in Proverbs, we should stop and let it resonate within us. This is not mere existence or survival. When the sage talks about laying hold of life, experiencing life, or in this case, life springing forth, he is talking about robust and rich fulfillment, actualizing the full ability for which we are intended. It's a very rich word. Now, that's not the aim of these particular comments right now in verse 23. That's just a free sidelight. In the next few minutes, we'll be talking about digging into the original language, Hebrew, and a little comment on Greek. If you've had those languages, either of them, this will reinforce some things you've learned and you will realize the benefit of it. If you haven't had it, you'll be able to understand most of this. You'll just miss some of the finer details about it, but bear with me. So we have this phrase, "Against every imprisonment, protect your mind." In Hebrew, that is mikol, that is from all, mishmar, that's imprisonment, netzor, that's the command, protect, and then libecha, your mind or heart. Mikol, mishmar, netzor, libecha. This translation that I'm proposing reflects the use of the verb natsar, meaning to protect, together with the preposition min, meaning from or separate from. When construed with the verb natsar, the preposition min has the meaning separation from, and here I'm rendering it against every imprisonment. That's in a sense separated from every imprisonment. Taken together, natsar min means to protect something of value from or against an external hazard. For additional examples of this very construction, natsar min, to be protected from or against, and all of these happen to be poetic, we can refer to the following passages. Psalm 12:7 in the English, 12:8 in the Masoretic text. Psalm 32:7. Psalm 34:13, verse 14 in the Masoretic text, and that instance, Psalm 34, has this structure twice. Psalm 64:1, verse 2 in the Masoretic text, and Psalm 140, verses 1 and 4, or if you're reading it in Hebrew, verses 2 and 5. In each of those cases, we find the same verb to protect, and then the preposition from. So we have these verses conveying the notion of protecting something from a hazard, or protecting them against being damaged by a certain hazard. Incidentally, the very next verse right here in this, what we're calling poem 3 of Proverbs 4, the next verse then will be chapter 4, verse 24. We find the sage using that same preposition, min, meaning from or separate, using it with that standard connotation. It reads like this: rid yourself of, or rid yourself from, a twisted mouth, and put crooked lips far from you. So this idea of min, meaning separate or away from, is something that's right in the material, the very next verse, very explicitly. Consider next then this noun, mishmar. It can refer to a facility for incarceration, or it can also refer to the activity by which people are kept under restraint or guard. It can also refer to a cohort of soldiers who perform that service. So it could be rendered a prison, that facility. It could be rendered an imprisonment, the activity of keeping people under guard, or it could be rendered a division of guards, the people who do that job. Now, in the second half of our target verse, verse 23, in the second half, the sage explains why it is so essential to protect one's mind against such restraint, such imprisonment. Confinement of the mind within this metaphoric prison, he says, amounts to a virtual death sentence. Notice the last half of verse 23. Under such restrictions, the mind, you see, is powerless to issue out those initiatives that are necessary for true vitality. It reads, for from there, from the mind, life springs forth. The implication, if the mind is imprisoned, that life is powerless to spring forth. The sage will build on this motif of harmful imprisonment in the very next poem. The next poem spans all of Proverbs 5. If you're to look particularly at verses 9 through 11, you will see that he wants to safeguard the youth there against getting trapped or imprisoned. So he urges the youth, keep your way a good distance from. Notice that preposition mean, to be separate. That's in chapter 5, verse 8. Keep your way a good distance from the acute danger that's posed by the seductive sweetness of what he calls the foreign woman's lips, and also the slipperiness of her mouth. Those two elements are referred to in chapter 5, verse 3. So once again, imprisonment occurs here in chapter 4, verse 23, as something that the mind should be protected from. And when we get to the next poem that starts in chapter 5, we find out there are some real hazards of being trapped. It's this sort of thing that he's anticipating here in poem 3, chapter 4, verses 20 and following, anticipating it and wanting the youth to be set up to guard himself against this entrapment. If we were to look at chapter 4, verse 23 in a version such as New Revised Standard, we'll find the expression mikol mishmar, which I'm rendering against every imprisonment. In NRSV, we'll find that rendered with the phrase with all vigilance, rather than against every imprisonment. While this is consistent with the Septuagint, and here we have the expression all guarding expressed in the dative, which conveys the idea of with all guarding or with total vigilance. Yet to render it thus would require treating the Hebrew preposition min, which we are rendering from, rendering it instead as describing that material out of which or from which something is formed. Then the preposition from would designate the source material. I want to be quick to acknowledge that that is a legitimate use of the preposition min, that is, designating source material from which or out of which something is made or formed. That's one of the options for min. And if that is the track that we follow, such as with NRSV, then the sage here would be advising the youth to resort to a sort of metaphoric store of complete guarding, total vigilance, and from there draw out for himself a maximum level of fortitude that the youth should then employ, directing those resources of strength and protection to safeguard his mind. So out of a store of maximum vigilance, then equip yourself, fortify yourself, then turn to your mind and declare that as the treasure that you are now going to totally guard. Now, this interpretation is possible, yet it overlooks the meaning of protect against, which we saw attested several times in Psalms from the actual wording natsar min. For that reason, I do not feel that NRSV has made optimal use of the Hebrew that's available to us. There's another approach that some scholars use to translate this phrase, against every imprisonment, protect your mind. Some render it, above all else, guard your heart. Fox does so in his commentary. Or, above every watch, that is, every guarding activity, guard your heart. And so Bruce Waltke renders it. Incidentally, Waltke's and also Fox use the word heart, where I'm rendering it mind. That's not the focus of our distinction here in this conversation. Heart or mind, either is fine. I trust that by now you've picked up on the advantage of rendering the Hebrew word lave as mind, given the intellectual framework, the thinking and reasoning framework that is very much the climate of the book of Proverbs. But rather here, we're wanting to examine the strength, the relative strength of what they're proposing above all else, or above every watch, rather than what I'm recommending, against every imprisonment. Protect your mind. Now, in support of Fox and Waltke, their alternatives treat the preposition min, meaning from, as a comparative, combined with all, or as Fox then renders it, above all else, and Waltke, above every or all watch or guarding activity. And so they understand this as the sage directing the youth to guard his mind with a measure of care that would exceed every other vigilance. Ratchet up your vigilance to the total max, redline it, and that is what your mind is worth guarding. While this meaning is possible, this approach is not to be preferred, in my opinion, since it does not take into consideration the meaning of protecting against. Once again, that meaning that we found for natsar min in several passages of Psalms. And secondly, this approach, recognizing min here as a comparative, strains the rules of Hebrew grammar in two ways. Let me explain. First, the two objects that are being compared in a situation like this should both be governed by a single verb or condition. Let me give you an example. This comes from Genesis 37. It's in narrative. Genesis 37:3. In this situation, we learned that Israel, the father figure, loved Joseph, one of his sons, more than, there's our comparative, more than he loved all his sons, meaning the rest of them. Joseph got the premier dose of love coming from his father Israel. In that situation, I think we'd quickly recognize that both entities that are being compared, Joseph on the one hand, and then all his sons, all of Israel's sons, the other 11, these are both objects that are governed by a single verb. Joseph is loved and all his sons are loved. The discriminating feature is how much love they're getting. Joseph gets the lion's share. Let's take that same lens or viewpoint now into Proverbs 4:23. In that case, the two objects that correspond to Joseph on the one hand and his sons on the other, Israel's sons, that is, the two objects in Proverbs 4:23 would be your heart or mind on the one hand, and then I wonder what you would identify as the other element that's in the comparative balance. Are you recognizing that the other element that's there is every watch, to use Waltke's rendering? Every watch. For the preposition mean to operate as a comparative, both objects need to be governed by a single verb, just like Joseph and then the other brothers are both loved. So in Proverbs, both mind and every watch should be the objects that are governed by the verb to be protected. Against every imprisonment, protect your mind. Now, admittedly, mind is certainly suitable for protection. However, while the expression every watch implies that some protection is going on, it's not a normal object of protection. It's like protecting a protection. It's a bit circular. A more suitable object, which could have been used in this very passage had the sage wanted to, and another object that would have been parallel to protecting the heart or mind, would be to insert something of value, something on the order of, quote, all precious things, end quote. So that we would have, on the one hand, more than you protect all precious things, you ought to a superlative degree, protect your mind. So both mind and all precious things would both be objects that are being protected, instead of protecting the mind and protecting protection. I hope by this point you're sensing how that particular facet of the rendition with a comparative it's used by both Fox and Waltke doesn't exactly fit, doesn't fit easily with the Hebrew grammar. There's a second dimension of the Hebrew grammar that's a bit problematic in that interpretation. For you see, the preferred item, in the case of Israel, Joseph, and his other sons, the preferred item was Joseph, and then the less preferred item was the other sons. So we can see there that the preferred item should belong to the larger set that's modified by all. Brown-Driver-Briggs' lexicon brings out this particular component for the comparative use of mean with modified by all. There's another feature of Hebrew grammar which raises question for the interpretation offered by Fox and also Waltke. So secondly, the preferred item, in our case it would be mind or heart, should belong to the larger set that's modified by the word all. Incidentally, if you'd like to look this up, turn to Brown-Driver-Briggs. Under the preposition mean, subsection 6, they talk about this principle for the comparative with all. Returning to the example of Israel, the father figure, loving Joseph more than he loved all his sons, then we see that Joseph, the preferred element, belongs within the larger set circumscribed by the term all his sons. Joseph was one of them. So according to this principle, now back to Proverbs 4, the sage's preferred commodity, and that is the mind, should belong to the larger set that's modified by the word all, or every. And yet, in this case, that every component is every watch, or every guarding, every imprisonment. If the sage intended that mikol, meaning from all, would convey the comparative, meaning more than all, he could have done so with a term like kol basar, all flesh, a term that would have circumscribed a larger set that would subsume under its umbrella the particular subcomponent mind. For mind is a part of all flesh in the general sense. In fact, the sage actually used the expression kol basar, all flesh, in the hemistich immediately preceding verse 23a. That is, back up just a half verse to 22b, and we see that very expression. The sage could have used that in 23a, and then we would have had a very neat arrangement where we have the umbrella category, all flesh, and then we have the preferred particular, mind, and the grammatical structure would have worked. It would have read something like this: more than you post watch over anything within your flesh, especially post watch over your mind. But instead we have this expression that, as it stands now, reads something like this: more than you post watch over posting watch, post watch over your mind. I trust you can see this. While it's conceivable within the Hebrew grammar, it's just a bit rough. It's a bit of a strain to see that as reasonable interpretation of Hebrew grammar. For these reasons, it seems better to regard the acceptable but not quite fitting translations offered by NRSV, once again that was with all vigilance, and then also the comparative use of mean that's preferred by Fox and Waltke, where they render it above all else or above every watch. Keep these in mind as wordplay options, not the most straightforward recognized meaning of the Hebrew in the native audience, but they could have said to themselves, it sounds like it might have one of these other connotations, but it seems the best and most straightforward is to go with Natsar Min as the dominant structure here, that is, protect from or against a hazard, and identify Mishmar as the hazard, imprisonment or incarceration or restraint. And in this way, the sage is saying, your mind is something that can be taken captive. Do everything possible to make sure your mind never falls captive. And then notice the reinforcement in the end of verse 23. The rationale is this: if you let your mind be taken captive, the lights go out, basically, because that's where life springs out. It springs forth from your mind. And if your mind is trapped, if your mind has become a prisoner, if it has been kidnapped, if it has been hijacked, then frankly, your life's over with. We're not saying that a person would physically expire at that point, but the sage is saying life in true vitality is over for you if your mind is lost. In the next portion of this lecture, we'll focus on the macro and micro structural features that give shape and a sense of topography to this poem.